Well, I am one of those people where the journey is not the destination. The destination is the destination. When I'm going somewhere, I want to get there as quickly and efficiently as humanly possible. Obviously, want to be safe, but just the trip is not necessarily the journey for me. Now, there's this scene in the Disney movie and in the book Alice in Wonderland where Alice is lost in the woods and she meets the Cheshire Cat and she asks the cat, she said, I wanted to ask you which way I ought to go. And this is a familiar story. And the cat says, that depends on where you want to get to. And Alice responds, well, it doesn't really matter. And so the cat then responds, then it really doesn't matter which way you go. And I think there are many people in life that is how they are functioning. They're not sure where they're going to get to, but they want to know what direction to go. If you don't have a place where you're going, then what difference does it matter which path you take? Now, I came across this story of this philosopher and this guy who was managing his schedule. And the philosopher was in a city for several appointments, and the scheduler had things lined out for him, so he could go to this appointment and that appointment. And they're going from one to the next, and the scheduler says, if we hurry and catch this train, we will save 3 minutes. And the philosopher replied, and what significant things shall we do with the 3 minutes we are saving? That's just resonated with me, because too many times I think, well, I'm going to do this to save time or save money or whatever that necessarily means. Well, what am I going to do with that savings that I incur? Often what it means is that we just rush around life, saving all of this time, but aren't actually doing anything with it. See, sometimes we need to know where we're going, but we also need to know what our foundation is, where we're starting, right? If you're traveling somewhere, your starting point is really important to know. If your starting point is not where you are, then the directions from somewhere else isn't going to actually help you. This is where wisdom comes in. And James talks about wisdom in his book, James chapter 3. And we'll start in verse 13 this morning. But James talks about wisdom, and wisdom is foundational for who we are and the direction of our lives. Wherever we get our wisdom determines where we're going and how we're going to get there, and determines our starting point. He says in James 3, starting in verse 13, if you are wise and understand God's ways, prove it by living an honorable life, doing good works with the humility that comes from wisdom. And so he's talking about godly wisdom. Now, one of the things about godly wisdom is that godly wisdom will bring a good life, but a good life does not necessarily bring godly wisdom. If you are wise according to God, then you're going to have a life that's together, a life that's organized. Now, we'll have unfortunate things that happen to us. I'm not saying life's going to be perfect, but just because you have a good life doesn't mean that you have godly wisdom. And there's a difference between knowledge and wisdom. We know this, but James is kind of making sure we understand that wisdom has the practical application to it. It's almost as though a specialist is able to apply an expertise in a particular subject. It's not just knowing things. It's just not able to understand and regurgitate facts, because our character counts. When we're talking about wisdom, our integrity matters. And it's important to what it means to follow God with wisdom. But wisdom has to have humility. If we don't have humility, then we don't have godly wisdom. Those two things go together. Humility is evident in those who have godly wisdom. And too many times we think of these words like wisdom and think, oh, it's weak and it's not strong. Another word that we might put in that same category is meek. Meekness is not something that say, man, I aspire to be meek. That's where I really want to be, because we associate it with being weak. But meekness can be kind of defined as power under control. We can think of a horse that is performing a task, it's pulling something heavy. The horse has been trained to do it, and it's using its power in a productive way. That is how God wants to use us. He wants to have great power that's under control. But false wisdom, wisdom that doesn't come from God, what it does is it puts me at the center of the universe. It says, God, you stay over there. I'm going to be right in the center. Everything's going to be about me, for me, and it's just going to be me. Now, God does not tolerate that sin. God doesn't tolerate sin in general. But when we take God and push him out of the center of the universe, I personally think God takes offense to that. It says, who are you? Just a normal human being to think that you are bigger and stronger and better than God. But false wisdom isn't necessarily unintelligent. It can actually be very dangerous because it can have wisdom, can have understanding, but what it does is it can manipulate the situation into their favor. You can use people maybe without them knowing it. You manipulate people to do what you want them to do. So that's where wisdom, and that's the foundation for who we are. If our wisdom is founded in God, then that determines the direction of our life. If our wisdom is founded in something else, that determines the direction of our lives. Because James goes on to say, but if you are bitterly jealous, and there is selfish ambition in your hearts, don't cover up the truth with lying and boasting. For jealousy and selfishness are not God's kind of wisdom. They are earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. For wherever there is jealousy and selfish ambition, there you will find disorder and evil of every kind. Nobody aspires to be bitter or jealous, selfish, or envious. That's not something that we just, today I'm going to focus on being more jealous today. That's not something we wake up saying we're going to be doing. But yet our culture pulls us to that mentality. Our culture pulls us away from Jesus and says, it's all about you. It's about how you can be better, how you can succeed. And so if that's where we're founded, if that's our wisdom, that determines the direction of our life. That influences how we do what we do. Wisdom from Jesus is different than wisdom from the world. See, the more we know, if we have worldly wisdom, then it's just knowledge and information about how to manipulate the situation in your favor. And the more we know, the more tempted we are to misuse that information. Think about it for a minute. Let's say you and a coworker are up for a promotion. If you know things about your coworker that you can use to give yourself a leg up in the promotion, there's a temptation to use that. Now there are certain things. If your coworker is embezzling from the company, obviously we need to kind of communicate that in appropriate means. But if you know that your coworker just is poor with managing money and your job has nothing to do with managing money, trying to use that to leverage yourself to look better is manipulative. That's the worldly wisdom. Now, Jesus doesn't say that we need to not have any personal ambition, but we're talking about selfish ambition. Selfish ambition tries to destroy others so that I might get more, that I might improve and get better. See, when our wisdom is not founded in Jesus, when someone tries to correct us, improve us, give us suggestions about ourselves, dare I say, rebuke us, we get defensive. We say, well, I'm not going to take that because the world revolves around me. If the world doesn't revolve around God, then it might as well revolve around me. That's where we get to. That's what it comes to. That's the logical conclusion. And envy, strife, jealousy seep into our lives, but those things can't survive if we have humility, especially if that humility is derived by godly wisdom. But the worldly wisdom is unspiritual. And what it does is it makes us in competition with each other. Because worldly wisdom has the understanding that in order for me to gain, you have to lose. So as I think about that, it makes me wonder, if that's really what it is, what's the difference between humanity and the rest of creation and animals? Dog eat dog world. If I have to gain and if you have to lose in order for me to gain, why shouldn't I assert my authority, make you look bad so I get more? If I'm the center of the universe, if my wisdom isn't founded in God, then I'm the center of the universe. I might as well knock you over so I can improve. There's nothing that should stop me. If God is not in my life, then what's the moral compass that says I need to be nice to you? Worldly wisdom seeks to destroy others, and that's how it becomes evil and demonic. Now, you may say there are people who don't know Jesus who are still morally good. I get that. But the reality is, if our wisdom is not founded in God, then the direction of our lives is dramatically different. It's changed. It's altered. If our wisdom is just how can I improve, how can I live a good life, and that's it, then it changes our morals and ethics and what's acceptable and how we can treat others. Now, we can think of our world. There's disorder. I think everybody can agree our world is a mess. One thing that we need to remember, it always has been a mess. There's nothing new under the sun. Sin has always been prevalent in our world, but for whatever reason, we're more aware of it now than I think we ever have been. What happens is too many people are putting their hope in worldly wisdom. They're putting their hope in things of this world, and it's so evident the closer we get to elections. Even midterm elections we go crazy over, but yet we got a presidential election coming up, and you see that people are putting their hope in all those things. But I'll tell you what, if God's purposes cannot be fulfilled because the correct legislation isn't passed, then we've got the wrong God. If God's purposes can't be fulfilled because the wrong person gets elected, then we've got the wrong God. What it's saying is that people have authority over God, that unless we do things, God is handcuffed. Now, God limits himself. He works through his people. But just because something does or doesn't happen doesn't mean God's purposes and plans are completely thwarted. See, without Jesus, we're going to continue to be frustrated by the world. And there's nothing that's going to change that. The world is not going to get to a point where we're so happy with what's happening that we're just good. It's only through Jesus can those frustrations actually be taken care of. Can they actually go away? Until Jesus transforms, we're going to be frustrated. But what we are called to do is not just sit here and say, Jesus, transform those people over there. We first and foremost have to make sure we're transformed ourselves. And I think there are too many people who are following Jesus that are worrying about other people, not their own spiritual lives. I also say that if we are following Jesus, then we need to be active for him in our world. We can't just say, well, things should be better. We need to stand up for the marginalized, the oppressed. We need to make sure that life is valued. That just because somebody doesn't have the societal worth or standing doesn't mean they're less valuable. No matter who you are, no matter what you're doing, no matter your bank account, your IQ, your perceived talents, you are valuable to God. And that is a message the church and the followers of Jesus need to proclaim loudly. You are valuable to God. And there may be people here today that you may have walked in and say, my sense of worth is low. You know what? Jesus values you. You are important and precious to Jesus. Not because of anything you can do, just because he loves you, he created you. That's it. You don't have to be anything special for Jesus to love you. He does. And that is the message we need to make sure the church displays and shares. But then James goes to the positive side. He says, but wisdom from above is first of all pure. It is also peace-loving, considerate, and submissive. It is full of mercy, produces good deeds, impartial and sincere. Those who are peacemakers who plant in peace will reap a harvest of righteousness. Now, if you look at that section, those 3 verses in James, it kind of parallels what Apostle Paul talks about in Galatians chapter 5. Galatians 5, the Apostle Paul shares the fruit of the Spirit. And he says the fruit of the Spirit are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law. Right? There's no law that says you can't be patient. Right? That they don't make legislation against patience. Those are things that the Holy Spirit wants to produce in our lives, marks of what Jesus is doing. And so James is kind of writing his own, these are the marks of the Spirit, the evidence that the Spirit is in your life. And the first one he starts with is pure. Now the purity that James is actually discussing here emphasizes the purity of God, the holiness of who God is. Because when this would have been understood, this purity is purity to the extent that you are able to approach the gods. See, even in the ancient times when they had polytheism and all these other gods, they still had reverence for the gods, and you had to be pure in order to approach them. When we have godly wisdom, it purifies us so that we are now able to be at a state where we can approach God and focus on His holiness. Brother James says the next one is peace-loving. Now, there are some people in our lives, some people you know, that live in a state of constant drama. And if that's you, I'm sorry. And even if it's not you, you see those people, and it's exhausting to know the drama they have in their lives, whether it's something they are in control of or something they aren't. But there's nothing holy about being passive. There's nothing holy about avoiding confrontation. The peace that James is talking about here is in right relationship. Right relationship with people and right relationship with God. Now, you can't be in right relationship with people unless you're in a right relationship with God. But once you're in a right relationship with God, your relationships with people will be impacted by God and hopefully moved and transformed to be healthier. The next one he talks about is considerate or gentleness, depending on your translation. This is in contrast specifically with selfish ambition. You know, selfishness is natural. It's something that people just generally do. I want, I need, that's mine. Don't take that away from me. We're about ourselves. But the selfishness in our lives hurts our relationships. It hinders them. It gets in the way. But this consideration that James talks about, what it does is it differentiates between the letter of the law and the heart of the law. It knows when to apply the strict letter of the law and when to actually give grace. One of my favorite examples in the Bible of knowing when to apply the strict letter of the law or extend grace is the story of Mary and Joseph. If you remember, Mary was pregnant through the Holy Spirit, and Joseph found out, excuse me, and in Joseph's mind, it looked as though Mary had been unfaithful. And so, because she was unfaithful, Joseph decided that they should no longer be together. Well, according to the law, Mary should have been stoned to death. She should have been killed for what was the perceived transgression. Well, Joseph was considerate to Mary. He had compassion for her. So he didn't want to, excuse me, he didn't want to have her killed. He didn't even want to disgrace her publicly. He decided to divorce her quietly so that they could just go their separate ways and Mary could live her life and not just ruin her life. He could have ruined her life, but he didn't. Now, we know the story goes on that Mary gave birth to Jesus and Joseph and Mary stayed together and God did a wonderful work through that. But Joseph extended grace as opposed to following the letter of the law. Just because we can condemn someone doesn't mean we should. The next one is submissive that James talks about, or willing to yield to others. Now, there are some people that enjoy a good argument. You know, I love the phrase, you know, you got to pick your hill to die on. Which thing are you going to really fight for? There are some people that just create hills so they can die on them, I feel. Like they get the shovel and they're creating a hill just so they can die on it. Willing to yield to others, submissive, is not about just letting people bulldoze you. It's not about making it so you just never get your way. It's not just going with the flow. What it does is it means to be able to persuade by not being stubborn and a willingness to listen. It's able to empathize with the other person, to hear what they're saying and understand where they're coming from. See, godly wisdom is not rigid. Now, we don't compromise the truth, but man, if we're just beating people over on their head with the truth of Jesus, then I think we're missing the wisdom that God wants to give us. Because Jesus draws people to him. He says, I love you, I want you, I want to forgive you. Now there's a standard that comes with it, but Jesus draws people. He doesn't beat people into submission. This willingness to yield knows when to take a stand and when not to. Then James talks about full of mercy. Godly wisdom is full of mercy. Now, I love to compare and contrast the difference between grace and mercy. In the church, at least from my perspective, we talk much more about grace than we do mercy. Because what grace is receiving something you don't deserve. I don't deserve heaven, but God, with his grace, gives me an opportunity to get to heaven through Jesus Christ. And so part of why we talk about grace is we want to talk about the good stuff we get. Woo! God's grace, I get heaven, right? Yeah, we're excited about that. That's encouraging. Mercy is not receiving something you deserve. I deserve hell. I deserve condemnation, but through the mercy of Jesus Christ, I can be saved from hell. That's what James is saying, and we need to be full of mercy. And this mercy gives practical help. But what this mercy doesn't worry about is whether the situation was self-inflicted or not. See, many people need help. They need compassion. They need mercy. And a lot of times they find judgment. Well, how did you find yourself in that situation to begin with? Do you deserve my help after you shot yourself in the foot? Mercy isn't worrying about the circumstances that led to the situation. It gives help regardless. Now, we also need to be wise, and there's certain things we can and can't do, but too many times I think we use that as an excuse of, well, the person's getting what they deserve. You know, they made their choices, they made their bed, now they've got to sleep in it. As opposed to extending mercy that Jesus calls us to extend. Because the next one James talks about is that we need to be impartial. Godly wisdom moves us to be impartial. Now, all people have personal biases. We have to recognize that personal bias is a part of life. When my freshman year of high school, the first day of history class, our teacher, the biggest thing we accomplished that day, and he did this every year with freshman class, is he wrote on the board, "What is history?" And so for the whole period, we worked through what that actually meant. And the definition he moved us to understand is that history is what we know of the recorded past. Right? There are things that happen in history that weren't recorded and we just don't know. But with this, we also recognize that history is almost always written from the perspective of the winner. There's a personal bias with history of what's being communicated, of what's important, of what the actual purpose is. And James is telling us that the godly wisdom that we can receive through Jesus can help us overcome those in a way that allows us to use who we are to build God's kingdom. We're still going to have personal biases. We're going to have things that influence us, but this impartiality is a way that we can impact people for Jesus without having selfish ambition in our lives. It's not about me. It's not about how I can improve or how I can succeed. See, this impartiality is also about being unwavering in our convictions. We have the willingness to yield, submissive, but we also need to make sure that we stand true on who Jesus is. We know who Jesus is, we're confident in that, and we're going to proclaim him. We're going to proclaim him sincerely. Many people have frustrations with the church, call it phony, hypocritical, those types of things. And don't get me wrong, there's plenty of that to go around. But I think that's everybody, regardless if you're in the church or not. There's plenty of phoniness in the world. There's plenty of people who put on a facade and say, well, I want to look this way, whatever that necessarily means, but they aren't really that way to begin with. But if we had godly wisdom, then the hypocrisy in our lives will be melted away through the grace and the power of Jesus in our lives. The sincerity that comes with godly wisdom means that we're no longer deceptive. We're not trying to improve ourselves at the sake of others. We're trying to be Jesus in the world. Be honest. We don't pretend. We never act apart for selfish gain. But then, if all of these things happen, then as James says, we're peacemakers who plant in peace. We're going to sow a harvest of righteousness. Now, one of the things that I'm thinking through with this particular message from James is I know that there are a lot of you, you're doing the best you can. You know, there are times we go through life and we say, I'm giving it all I have. And Jesus honors our efforts. I'm confident that Jesus doesn't just want to make us feel bad for what we're doing. But I also know that there are probably some of you who are sitting here today listening to this message from James saying, I got to get something figured out. There's something wrong. And you know what? Jesus has something for both of those people. For those people, if you're trying as hard as you can, Jesus says, I'm going to extend more grace and mercy to you. Just come to me and I'll help you figure this out. If there are some of you who say, I've got to get something figured out, my life's a mess right now, Jesus, come to me, I'm going to give you grace and mercy, we're going to figure this out together. Wherever you are, Jesus says, I want to figure this out with you. It's not about looking the part. If we're going to have godly wisdom that brings sincerity, then we got to get rid of the phoniness in our lives. But too many people are like Alice, asking for what should I do? Where should I go? And somebody can say, well, where do you want to get to? Well, I don't know. Somewhere. Then what difference does it make where you go? What difference does it make the path that you are trying to travel? We have to make sure our starting point is in the wisdom that comes from Jesus Christ. And when our wisdom is in Jesus Christ, we've got our starting point. We've got the place where we're going to start. And you know what happens is that Jesus gives us discernment and wisdom and says, here's where you need to go. And so we get our starting point, and then that determines our direction. Wherever your wisdom comes from, it impacts the direction of your life. If your wisdom doesn't come from Jesus, it doesn't matter where you go. Just figure it out. Do what makes you feel good. Do what feels right. But if your starting point is with Jesus, then it says, here is where we're going. Because we're not just wandering aimlessly in life. Jesus says, I want you to build my kingdom. I want you to impact the world with my love and my message. That is what Jesus wants us to do. See, right relationships in this world begin with a right relationship with Jesus and allowing Him to be the foundation for all that we are. And a foundation in Jesus helps us discern where we are to go. You know, in our home, we have a fireplace. And this last week, I just finished chopping the last of the wood. Feel real good about that, right? And we have this fireplace. We love it. It's a fantastic fireplace. And we use it all the time. And after a while, Hannah had this great idea. You know, maybe we need to clean the window on the fireplace. And we cleaned the window on the fireplace, and all of a sudden, it just became so much more beautiful. And the ambiance of the fire was just even greater than before. Because what had happened after so many fires, we had allowed the soot to build up on the window. So from one fire to the next, the difference wasn't very much. But after countless fires, that built up. And I think many people are living their lives that way. You know, we're allowing things to build up and build up and build up and build up, and we're not going to Jesus regularly to be cleaned. So our direction is distorted. We can't see Jesus because we've got this filth in our lives. We say Jesus is our starting point. And Jesus is where we derive our wisdom, and that determines our direction. But when our wisdom is cloudy, it's hard to discern. So what I want to challenge you today, have you been cleaned by Jesus recently? You know, the sermon, the text is on wisdom, but we got to be clean to be able to see clearly. Jesus wants to pour out his wisdom on us, but we've got to make sure we come to him and get that purity thing taken care of on a regular basis. Because when we have that purity from Jesus, everything else will naturally flow from who God is into our lives. So if you want a purity from Jesus, what I want to challenge you to, we're going to sing the song, Lead Me to the Cross, or Take Me to the Cross. I want to encourage you to pray, Jesus, how can I be cleansed today? You know, whether you need to pray in front of the altars, whether you need to kneel at your couch, whether you need to kneel in your pew, or just pray silently wherever you are, whatever that is, I'm going to challenge you, say, Jesus, how can I get that purity that comes from godly wisdom?